Hey everybody, my name's Darryl O'Barrow. Welcome back to Journey to VR. So the next couple of weeks are going to be super fun. I'm going to be sharing with you all the things that I figured out about doing look development work inside of Unreal. So this is perfect for anybody who's coming from Maya or 3ds Max who hasn't used Unreal in the past, kind of like me. So I'm going to be covering off things like how to get your models in there, how to get the lighting working well, how to get things like integrating synthetic objects with the photogrammetry environment so that they look appropriate, as well as things like some of the really cool post effects that the Unreal Engine brings to the table. So like I said before, it's going to be covered off over a couple different videos, but by the end of it all, hopefully you guys will have a basic understanding of how to do get your models inside of Unreal looking great, your photogrammetry models inside of Unreal looking really, really good. So thanks so much for taking the time to check it out. Cheers, everybody. All right, so here we are inside of Maya, and we're basically picking up where we left off last week. If you remember, what we were doing is we were trying to create some graffiti that looked like it was in the environment before the photogrammetry process happened. And we were doing that using a layered texture. So I want to get this information into Unreal. So the first thing I need to do is take this layered texture and bake it down into a single UV map that's going to then get applied to my geometry. So what I've done is I've actually used just a simple placement node to offset the urban tag to get it into the right place. What we want to do is we want to bake that transformation node into the actual placement of this texture map and then layer it on top of itself inside of Photoshop. So how do you do that? It's really, really simple to do inside of Maya. If you just right mouse click on top of a texture, you can always say test texture. Now keep in mind that you can go ahead and set your resolution for your texture testing done up here in the options in the Hypershade window. So this clamps out at 4K. Hopefully that'll be high enough resolution for you guys. So I'll just test this guy out at a simple 1K map. You basically do that and off it goes, and the next thing you know, you've got your little texture map that's basically been baked out. Now I want to layer this urban tag on top of the original file in Photoshop. So what we're going to do is we're going to re-render this, except this time we're going to render it without that background layer visible. So we'll turn that guy off. We'll right mouse click on top of this. We'll say test texture. It's going to go through, and now I basically have my urban logo positioned correctly in the UV space for that model on a simple alpha with an alpha channel. So I can use that inside of Photoshop to go ahead and get my texture looking, really the way I want. And that's exactly what we've done here. So if we just kind of shrink this down a little bit, you can see that it's obviously sitting in the right place on the map. And I've layered this on top of itself a few different times just to kind of get it to have a little bit of bleed coming through. If you look at this guy, you'll notice that my bottom layer is set to darken. I've dropped the opacity down a little bit, so it's kind of burning through a bit. Then I did a normal layer that's got the fill set to something like 60%. And then I did another layer on top of that, which was just a simple screen to try to get that bright spot on the top, but still have a tiny, tiny bit of those walls coming through. And that's basically what we did for generating that map. And now I've got a UV map that will layer on top of my file with that urban tag inside of it, which is exactly what we need. So that's super, super cool. All right, so let's hop over to the Unreal Engine and I'll show you some really cool stuff. So here we are inside of Unreal, and the first thing I want to draw your attention to is a change that I've made in the project settings. So if you bring up the project settings and you go down into the engine section underneath rendering, I've set the renderer up to use the forward shading method. So forward shading is available in version 4.14 of Unreal, and it's a rendering approach that's ideally suited to doing VR. So it's about 22% faster according to the guys over at Epic. And it also has the ability to do some really nice things like multi-sample anti-aliasing. So this is an anti-aliasing approach that is going to give you better results in VR. Your textures and your scene's going to look more crisp and sharper in the VR headset. With that said, there are a few limitations. Things like screen space reflections don't work, and something like maybe IES lighting profiles don't work. There's a few other things that aren't supported. I'm not using any of those in my project, so I feel like it's totally worth getting that speed improvement as well as a quality improvement of using a forward shading approach. And I imagine if you're doing a VR project using Unreal, you're going to want to do the same thing. Now, I've already got some content added into my content browser. This is just my FBX file of the reality captured environment, as well as a few texture maps that we'll be working with both this week and next week. So I'm going to drag and drop into my scene, my FBX file for my room, and we'll just get this guy zeroed out to the origin. And with that done, I'm going to go ahead and just drag a point light into here and begin lighting this environment. So this looks cool. Obviously, we've got this point light that's adding in some basic illumination to this scene. But this isn't the look that I want to get to. Ultimately, the look that I want to have is relatively similar to the default textures that were done from the photogrammetry or the reality capture. So if we go to an unlit mode, we've now turned off all the lighting contribution from the synthetic lights, the Unreal lights. And this is just pure color. And obviously all that really great detail and lighting information is already there because of the photogrammetry or the reality capture. So this is essentially relatively close to the look that I want to get to. Obviously, I want it to be sort of hyper real, so I'm going to layer some stuff on top of this. But this is basically similar to what I want to get to. Now, keep in mind, I need to have objects be able to cast shadows in this scene. And that's what I'm going to be showing you this week, is how to build up an appropriate looking lighting model for my walls with shadows at work and look cool. Next week, then I'm going to show you how to do some other things, some other looked up things like reflections with some reflection probes, some indirect illumination, as well as doing some post effects like glows and blooms and grain and film grading and all that stuff. That will be part 2 of the video. So part 1 is basically getting a cool lighting model for my walls with shadows that look appropriate. So with that said, let's go ahead and drag in a piece of geometry to begin casting some shadows in this environment. So if we jump over to Basic and grab a sphere inside of here and pull this up. Now, obviously, there's no shadows happening, and the sphere is pure white because we're in this unlit mode. As soon as we go to a lit mode, we now have this direct illumination coming from that point light, and obviously the shadow happening on the floor appropriately. So what we want to do is we want to start building up a look for our walls that has a combination of shadows with that nice unlit look. So in the process of doing that, I'm going to walk you through how shaders and materials work inside of Unreal, sort of the basics here. Not too deep, but give you a quick intro to it. So if you take something like the walls material and double click on it, it brings up the editor for that object. Now this editor is relatively similar to the Hypershade window inside of Maya or the Slate editor inside of Unreal. So it's got a section for the nodes, it's got a preview section over here, and then obviously the palette has all the different nodes that you can use to start to build up more complex shading. You can drag and drop these out by simply dragging and pulling them out, or if you want, you can basically look at the hotkeys next to it and click the hotkey, like hold down 1 and then click with your left mouse button and it adds a node. So pretty straightforward. Now the way you make connections, again, is also very easy and very, very straightforward. So essentially what we've got going on here is it's a Pbr workflow, right? So right now, all of these attributes, if they're not being piped with something, I believe have a value of 0.5. So if we take this value of 0 and pipe that into roughness, we now have no micro fractions scattering the light on the surface. We're going to have a very tight, hot highlight. And you can see that showed up in my little preview ball over here. Pretty straightforward. Notice that it didn't change in my actual viewer. And that's because you need to kind of push those results into the actual viewer by clicking the apply button. And I believe it looks, I'm not 100% sure what's happening here, but I guess basically it's going through and it's sort of compiling the shader now. So now you can see as I start to move this point light out there, we've got that really tight highlight happening right there. And obviously that's not going to be good for concrete. So I'm going to go back to this float value and just put that up to something like 0.85. Again, my preview ball updates. My viewer doesn't update. I click the apply button. It goes through, and just like that, we now have a roughness value of something that's probably pretty good for concrete. Now, with that said, I want to get back to having that texture map that we talked about earlier in our scene here. So if we just jump back over to my maps directory, I can simply drag and drop in a file into that viewer. Very easy, just like that. And we can use that to start to remap this texture. So if you grab the top, it grabs basically the combination of red, green, and blue. That's the alpha, so it's pretty straightforward. Again, not dissimilar from what you would see inside of Maya. So now if we click the apply button over here, it's going to come through and give us that nice urban tag on the wall there. So pretty straightforward stuff, and that's essentially how this works. Now, there are a few different shading models inside of here. Unfortunately, none of them do what I want. There's no shading model that says, give me unlit, but with shadows. And essentially, that's what I wanted to do. And, I kind of played around with a few different ways of doing it, just using shading nodes, like dragging this guy into emissive. So this would be very similar to, if I did this if I pumped something to incandescence inside of Maya and hit apply, it would be very, very similar to this. The problem with doing this is, obviously, as soon as I do that, I've now lost my shadows. And that's really the problem. The rest of the stuff actually starts to look pretty close to being what I'd want, but I've now lost my shadows. So what I needed to do was find a way to have shadows be darker, right? And I kind of got on the internet and looked around, and lucky for me, someone else was having the same problem. They were doing photogrammetry work, and they wanted to have hard shadows when they were texture mapping emissive. And essentially, they figured out how to do it. And it was actually one of our users. It was actually a guy in Madrid, in Spain, and Juan basically went through and figured this out. So here's his studio page. Super thankful that he did this, because now I can basically copy and paste his code and hack it into my file and make everything work. So thank you again so much, Juan, for doing the legwork on this. So essentially, I'm going to walk you through that process now. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to modify, and do this at your own risk, by the way. We need to modify a few of the configuration files in the actual engine to get his code to work. So essentially what we're doing is we're going through and we're going to be changing the shader code for this wall's material, this basic default shading model. So the first thing that I did is I went through and I changed a configuration file that is in your installation directory. So wherever you've installed the engine, in the configuration file, there's a console variables ini file, and I wanted to change a parameter in there to get myself put into shader development mode. What shader development mode does is it allows you to have the shaders recompile without having to actually quit the engine and restart the engine. So it makes working with the shader files as you're hacking them much, much easier, or as you're developing them, I guess I should say, much easier. So that console variable ini is the file you need to change, and the parameter or the comment that you need to basically uncomment is just shader development mode 1. So by default, that was commented out. So all I did was uncomment that, save it, and now every time I launch my version of the Unreal Engine, I'm in shader development mode, which means I don't have to have issues with compiling shaders in the real-time version. So really, really simple change there. Pretty straightforward. So the next thing we need to do is basically modify the code for the basic shaders inside of Unreal. And I did that by copying and pasting the code that Juan made. So this is really simple. It's just, a few lines of code change the way this works. Essentially what he's doing is he's going out there and he's finding the shadows. He's making his own variable here, his own float variable that has a little multiplier in there. So this allows you to adjust the intensity of the shadow so that you can balance it appropriately. And he's taking his bone shadow, which is basically what he just makes with these 4 lines of code, and multiplying that times the emissive color. So very, very simple, very straightforward. So you just basically copy that. I've already opened up this base pixel shader, and the base pixel shader, base pass pixel shader USF, also lives where your engine lives. So if we just jump over here, I'll show you that directory very, very quickly. So in the engine directory, in the shaders directory, there's the base pixel shader USF file. That's the one you need to edit with his simple line of code. And essentially you just kind of scroll down here and it's around 930. We're looking for the area where all the emissive code is. So if you come down here, scrolling, right there. So this half 3 emissive, that's basically where we want to paste it in. So just kind of come down there, pump that code inside of that guy, and I'll say file save. As soon as I save it, you can see that we've now saved this out at almost 4 o'clock. So now that I've done that, essentially I need to recompile the shaders. So if you hit Control-Shift period, it will recompile all the shaders. And if you go into your material editor and you just wiggle something, you'll notice that kind of makes it dirty. As soon as I wiggle that, you notice the apply button came back up. So all I have to do is hit apply. It goes through, it recompiles those shaders. And now, just like that, I've got shaders that are added into my scene that look cool and are kind of doing sort of what I want. They're giving me this nice shadow effect happening essentially on top of the emissive color. Now, obviously, if I wanted to play around with this, if I wanted those shadows to be pure black, I can just simply go back into this guy and instead of giving it a little bit of lift to 0.2, put that to 0, say file save on that guy, jump back over to my engine, wiggle this guy to make it dirty, click the apply button. It's going to go through, recompile the shaders, and now my shadows will be, pure black on top of that guy. So that is basically it. It's actually very, very simple, very straightforward. And then from here, I can start playing around with, lifting colors or adding in secondary illumination, adding in more lights, more glows. And that's going to be all the stuff that I'm going to be doing basically next week. So let me just go back and re-edit this file down to something that looks a little bit better. We'll just put that to like 0.3, hit file save, jump back to my engine, shake a node to make it dirty, hit apply on that guy. It's going to go through and sort of go through and make those shadows a little bit lighter. That looks pretty good. Now, the next thing I'm going to do on this, just to get myself set for next week, is double click on my detail shader, and we're going to drag and drop this same guy into emissive color on that guy, and click apply. And that's going to brighten up all my little, my staircases and trims and things like that. So that is basically it. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Thank you so much for watching Journey to VR. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Next week, again, I'm going to be going through and adding in indirect illumination to make the back of this sphere bright, some basic reflection map work, as well as some glows and post effects and things like that. So it's going to be super fun. If you've been watching this on Vimeo or YouTube, please make sure you take the time to go back to the area and check out the Journey to VR blog section. On there, I've been doing lots of recorded tutorials, as well as interviews with customers. We've got a lot of written articles that have also been put together that share best practices from our clients, and it's just it's a kind of fun website. So make sure you go check it out. And thank you again so much to Juan of Bone Studio in Madrid, Spain, for coming up with this kind of little workaround that gives me exactly what I needed to do, integrate CG elements with my photogrammetry. So that is it for this week. Cheers, everybody.